Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is coming to you at a very special time. It is the Monday before the historic Western States Endurance Run, and I can think of no better topic to discuss than how to race in the heat and what interventions we should actually use when we are racing in the heat. Regardless if you are one of the lucky ones that is towing the line for this year's Western States 100, or if you are training for another hot weather race, you are going to want to listen up, because on the podcast today, back for his second appearance, is Julien Périard, who is a research professor and deputy director of the University of Canberra Research Institute for Sport and Exercise, where he is also the lead of their environmental physiology research laboratory. Julien comes back on the podcast today to discuss very specifically how and what interventions do we actually use when there is a hot weather environment in front of us, which ones of these work, which one of these don't work so well, and how do they actually work differently. Julien is one of the foremost experts in this type on this particular subject. He's worked with the Australian Institute for Sport, international federations such as FIFA, World Athletics and World Triathlons. He also examines how regular exercise can be built as a resilience tool against rising global temperatures. He's authored over 125 research papers, book chapters, including a textbook on heat stress in sport and exercise. And the paper that we are going to use as a framework for today's discussion is a free open access paper, the link to which will be in the show notes. The title of it is Exercise Under Heat Stress, Thermoregulation, Hydration, Performance Implications, and Mitigation Strategies. It is a great one. It's a dense one with over 1,000 cited papers in it. But if you are interested in this topic, go and check that out. This podcast pairs very well with the first podcast that I did with Julien, which I will also link up in the show notes, the focus of which was more how to use acclimation and acclimatization strategies in order to prepare for the heat. So if you want the whole shebang, check that podcast out, as well as this podcast, which is very specifically focused on what to do when it's hot. Should you take an ice bath? Where should you put ice? Do these menthol gel works? Should you use an ice slurry? Should you cut holes in your shirt? What about these silly little headbands that everybody's wearing? We go through it all, and I hope that at the end of the day, everybody has a great toolkit for how to actually race and perform in the heat. And with that out of the way, I am getting right out of the way. Here's my conversation all about how to race in the heat with the incomparable Julien Périard. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, by the way.
Pleasure. Yeah.
I'm always reminded it's your winter, but our summer. So I don't know whether this is like a hot, quote unquote, hot topic for you, because all the North American countries are kind of going through their summer. The Northern Hemisphere countries are starting to go through their summer, but for you, it's kind of the opposite.
That's right. It's cool. So it's not necessarily a hot topic, but given it's an Olympic year and the Olympics are starting very soon, it's definitely a hot topic, obviously, pun intended.
And the endurance events at the Olympics, not to deviate too far from what we're going to talk about, it has the potential to actually be kind of warm there. I mean, it's July, it's in Paris, it's in the middle of the city. Like those are challenging environments for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And as you probably know as well, Europe kind of typically gets one heat wave per year as well. So those heat waves now are getting more frequent, more severe, more intense, a bit longer. So God forbid that there's a heat wave during the Olympics, but Paris could be hot. It's always a chance. It's July, middle of summer, so it will be hot. But just how hot it will be is, I guess, the question. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And ironically enough, I got a chance to actually run the Paris Marathon course when I was out there earlier in the year. And it's hard. It's a hard marathon course. Yeah. So I think you combine like the potential environment with a really hard course, and then it creates a really dynamic racing environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's hard. The athletes are producing a lot of heat. It's harder. They get hot. The environment is less conducive to losing heat. So it'll be interesting. We'll see. There's some time for that to materialize. But so we're going to talk about ultra running, and one of the things we're talking about offline is the Western States 100 is coming up. So we're recording this on the Thursday before the race, and this will actually post on the Monday before the race.
but it's close enough to know that it's going to be a relatively hot year. It'll be probably in the low 90s. That will continue to shake out between when we record this and when we actually post it. But there aren't going to be a lot of freebies as there have been in the past, where the temperatures are actually quite a little bit cooler. So we're going to talk about heat mitigation strategies, kind of in that context, in a prototypical ultramarathon context. What can athletes do during the race itself? What interventions can they undertake to make sure that, first off, they're safe, but second off, they can maximize performance? Because in a lot of these ultramarathons, you do have to take it from a safety first perspective, because the conditions can be so arduous and you're out there for so long, right? It's not sheerly performance that we're talking about.
That's right. Yeah, yes. I mean, you have to survive the course first of all, and if it's hot, then it makes it even worse. So, definitely you have to be prepared. And I think a lot of these things as well, they come down to the race organizers. So how well prepared the race organizers are to provide the resources to the athletes throughout the course and at what intervals and so forth.
Interesting you mentioned that. I had this great conversation with the race director, Craig Thornley, before the last hot year, which I believe was 2001, not 2021. And he had just ordered, like this was the Thursday or Wednesday before the race, another grip of ice. And we did the rough calculations there, and it turned out that he was that on average, he was ordering over 40 pounds of ice per athlete to disperse throughout all the aid stations. So, I mean, they take it seriously, and they do, I think that's a really great example where the race directors are trying to take care of the health and safety of the athletes. They're not thinking about it necessarily from the perspective of, oh, we want to make sure that the course record's broken or anything like that. They're literally trying to keep people safe. And part of the strategy that they're deploying to try to keep people safe is just to have as much ice out on the course as possible.
That's right. Yeah. And it's an interesting one as well, because I mean, logistically, just ordering all that ice, I mean, you need to produce that ice, you need to move it, you need to, put it all through the course. So if you parallel that with the Olympics, for example, where you have multiple events going on over several days, like, can you imagine logistically the amount of ice they need to produce and get to different locations? So, yeah, I mean, in terms of, it's which also demonstrates the importance of ice itself as a medium to kind of cool people down throughout different events even, right?
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about ice in a lot of different strategies. We're going to talk about ingesting ice. We're going to talk about carrying ice on your body, where you should use it and things like that. But I would be remiss to bring you on the podcast and not discuss something that's kind of like more powerful in all of this. And I hate to talk about this so close to, or have this podcast be released so close to the race, but we still have to mention it, right? We're going to talk about a lot of things that people can do during the race itself, but still the bigger tool in the toolbox, the bigger hammer that you should be using to get prepared for a hot weather race, or acclimatization and acclimation types of strategies. And I want you to kind of like paint the picture of the magnitude of how important those are in the whole thing before we start to get to the specific race stuff.
Yeah, sure. And you're right. I think acclimation and acclimatization are probably the most important things to do. So just a quick definition, I guess. So acclimatization is adapting to the environment, to the outdoor environment. So athletes that train on a regular basis in hot environments or throughout summer. So if you have a cold winter and then you get into spring, you acclimatize to summer as you train throughout summer, whereas acclimation is more artificial. So you go into a heat chamber if you have access to a heat chamber, or you jump into a hot bath after you're running outside in cool conditions. So it's more artificial. But what both of them do is induce adaptations that are a bit more specific, I guess, or I guess they're adaptations that improve physiological function. So if we think of heat acclimation relative to heat mitigation strategies like cooling or hydration, those are more acute. So they're in the moment, they're in the race, and if it's available for you, you can use it, you can cool down, or you can drink. Whereas heat acclimation kind of helps you adapt to that hot environment. So it helps you thermoregulate better. So you start sweating at an earlier core temperature. Your core temperature is lower to start with. You might sweat more if you reach your maximum sweat rate. Your sweating sensitivity is improved. So for a given core temperature, you might sweat a bit more. So obviously sweating is important, especially in hot conditions. well, primarily in hot conditions, because if the ambient air, for example, is hotter than our skin temperature, then the only avenue via which we lose heat is via sweating. Because the two main mechanisms are sweating and convection. So if your skin temperature in Celsius is 35 degrees and it's 30 degrees outside, then you have a negative gradient. So you can lose heat by convection that's the air going through over the body and kind of remove some of the heat. But the opposite is true. You can gain heat via air movement if air temperature is hotter. So at that point, once again, sweating becomes very important. But regardless, sweating is always the primary mechanism. So with heat acclimation, it improves your blood volume and your plasma volume. So you can sweat more. It improves your cardiovascular stability, so you can maintain your heart rate at a lower rate for longer in the heat. Because when we exercise in the heat, obviously we send blood to the periphery, to the skin to lose heat. But we also need to keep sending blood, obviously, to the muscles because they need oxygen to kind of, keep turning over. So there's that competition, so to speak, for blood flow. So with heat acclimation, you get those physiological adaptations to be able to maintain, I guess, your cardiovascular stability, heart rate a bit lower. By doing that as well, your perception of effort is a bit lower. If your core and skin temperature are lower, your thermal perception, so your perception of the environment, is better. So it's obviously those perceptual adaptations, those physiological adaptations that are induced with heat acclimation. So if you do that and then you go into a hot race, then you're obviously a step ahead of the competition. And if you can use those other mitigation strategies, so maintain, proper hydration, obviously eating well in an endurance race is obviously very important, but also potentially pre and cooling during. If you can combine all those things, then you're in an ideal scenario.
I'm really glad that you just mentioned the all of the above piece, because not to belabor the point too much on the acclimatization and acclimation strategies, but there is a menu of things that athletes can choose from. There's passive strategies, there are active strategies, there are combinations of both the passive and the active strategies. And coaches and athletes and physiologists have always kind of gone back and forth to what is quote unquote the best way to do it. And there really is no one single best one. It's all very situational depending upon what the athlete is actually going to experience. But the one thing that I always come away with all of this is that I want to kind of like finally touch on before we go to all the during interventions that we're going to talk about, is that irrespective of how you are actually trying to acclimate the athlete to a hot environment, it's not your prototypical endurance adaptation where it takes weeks and months and sometimes years to reap a benefit. We have this kind of like locked in our heads as endurance athletes, specifically, not team sports athletes, but endurance athletes. It takes months and months to create an adaptation from a physiological perspective. Most of the things that are happening when we put athletes in these hot weather environments actually happen on the order of several or maybe a dozen or 20 or so days. And that tends to trip up a lot of athletes when they're actually trying to prepare for this. And I was wondering if you had any kind of like commentary around that you could throw into the mix here.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a great point. And I think there's two things there. The one is the different approaches that you could use to heat acclimate, and then the time frame that you acclimate based on what, laboratory settings have deemed as being the optimal way. So first of all, there's different ways, and you're absolutely right. So the two classical ways are kind of you jump on a bike or on a treadmill in the lab, and you do the constant work rate or constant speed approach. So I say, okay, I do a VO2 max test and I find out my VO2 max is whatever. And then at relative speed of that, 65% of my VO2 max, let's say 12K an hour, I jump on the treadmill and I run at 12K an hour for 60, 90 minutes per day. And I do that for 10 to 14 days. So that's the recommendation. So if you do something 60, 90 minutes a day, 10 to 14 days, in hot conditions, again, I keep referring to Celsius, but roughly 40 degrees and 40% humidity. So just over 100 degrees and
that's hot.
40% humidity. Yeah, it's hot.
It's really hot.
Yeah. But that's the point, right? You want to induce adaptations. So you want to sweat a lot. You want to increase your skin blood flow, and you want to increase your heart rate. So those, and your core temperature, and the skin temperature. So if you induce kind of those responses, then you will adapt, and you want to get to that point and then maintain it. So that's one approach. So exercising at a constant speed. The other one is a self-paced approach. So you could do the same thing, again, thinking of an environmental chamber, for example. You jump on there and you just do intervals, or you just run how you feel. Another one is just passive, right? If you don't have access to an environmental chamber, you could just jump into a hot bath. That's completely passive. So you don't even have to exercise. If you jump into a hot bath, again, 40 degrees, 42 degrees, just over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to, I'm not exactly sure of the conversion, but given that our core temperature, again, in Celsius is around at rest, 37 degrees, you don't want your bath to be just slightly above that. You don't want 37 or 38 or 39. You want to go 40, 41 if you can tolerate it for a good 40 minutes or so to increase, again, your core temp, to sweat and so forth. So that's the passive approach. But the other one is if you don't have access to an environmental chamber and it's cool where you are, you can just do your run outside. You're still going to sweat. You'll increase your core temperature a little bit. But then when you come home, you jump into a hot bath, again, 20, 30 minutes, same kind of temperature, and that'll induce some adaptations. Another one is by controlling your core temperature, which is a bit more logistically challenging because you need to a way of measuring your core temperature. And typically it's increasing that to 38.5, again, degrees Celsius. And then you maintain that for about an hour. And then one that's similar and less logistically challenging is by a heart rate. So if you go into a hot room and you start running, you have to get to the heart rate you want to achieve, but then you just maintain that heart rate. And you'll find, let's say you do 10 days of acclimation at a controlled heart rate, you'll find that you'll have to lower your heart rate in your first session quite a bit. You'll have to lower your running speed to maintain a given heart rate when you're running in the heat. But then in the last session, you'll find that for the same heart rate, you lower your speed much later on in the session and much less. So that's the adaptation. So you'll get the same heart rate, actually the same core temperature, but you'll be running at a higher speed, which will be associated also with probably a higher sweat rate. So you're losing more heat. So there's all those different adaptations. And to come back to what's optimal, well, really, what's optimal is what you can do, right? What you have available to you logistically, financially, in terms of where you are, in terms of environment. So, and that's what we try to do with elite athletes, because elite athletes, let's say in the lab again, I would say, 14 days in the lab, 90 minutes a day, cycling or running at 65% of your VO2 max or whatever the intervention is. Obviously, athletes have quite significant, not significant, but quite regimented training programs, right? So if I'm going to tell an athlete, finish your 14-day acclimations 3 days out of or 4 days out of your race, they're going to be like, well, I don't think so, because I've got specific training planned. Yeah. So for the ultra distance athletes, as well as for Olympic and high level athletes, well, again, their training is very regimented. So I would recommend, and we've published a little bit on this, of kind of adapting that and doing basically your best to integrate heat into your training program. Because one of the things you need to remember as well is, like, yes, heat acclimation is probably the most important intervention you can do. But if that messes up your training and you don't get the training right, then there's no point of acclimating. I could be the most acclimated person in the world, but if I'm not running, well, what's the point, right? I'm not going to complete 100 miles if I'm running 20K a week, but I'm super acclimated, right? So get the training right, and then try to incorporate that as best you can. So you could even go out 3 months before or 2 months before, you can start doing 1 or 2 heat sessions a day. And then maybe in a period where, you have less of a focus on intensity, you can do a few more sessions in the heat. So you can kind of build it up and not do those 14 days in a row, but do 2 or 3 a week, and then have a week where you do a few more and do some top ups. So kind of putting it here and there where it fits, and then using the approach that fits your circumstances, I guess, is the recommendation I would provide to athletes, especially if they don't have access to a university lab or something like that.
Yeah, your point about access is actually really well taken. And then also the point about trying not to mess it up, right, in advance of an event, because you are trying to be relatively regimented. I'm going to link up in the show notes a couple of articles that I've written on this in terms of describing how we actually do this very, very practically with athletes. And it kind of boils down to a 2-phase protocol, where we do one phase, as you were mentioning, a few months or several weeks out from the event. And then we do the final phase a little bit closer, and maybe it's a little bit less intense because you're trying to balance all of the recovery and stuff like that. But it brings in all of these practical elements into the kind of what we know about research. So we won't belabor the point there. I'll leave, like I said, I'll leave some resources there. Okay, so it's going to be hot for Western states. One of the things I initially want to point out here is that we know a lot about cooling strategies during endurance events. But the primary reason that we know a lot about this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's the Olympic cycle. So whenever there's a hot, Olympics, whether it's Rio or the Atlanta Olympics or things like that, everybody gets like super interested in this, and all the
Mm.
teams and the national governing bodies start to pour a lot of resources into it, and research emerges. And the reason that I'm pointing that out is there is a really big difference in heat mitigation strategies that are intended for Olympic duration events and heat mitigation strategies that you might use from an ultra distance perspective. These Olympic events are, a couple hours long, traditional marathon, or maybe even a sprint triathlon or something like that. But then when you get into races that are 15, 16, 18, 20 hours long, or even the Badwater
Mhm.
ultra marathon or something like that, where you're constantly exposed to a hot weather environment, the strategies you use might actually change, and the strategies that you see deployed in a 40-kilometer time trial or something like that actually can have the potential to backfire. And the thing that I initially want to start to point out with this is something that you mentioned earlier, is there are two types of things that you're basically working on, right? You're working on your perception of the thermal strain, right? Your thermal comfort, and there are strategies that you can use to improve that. And then you are actually working on physiologically controlling your core temperature, using things to just make sure that your body is like literally not overheating. And there are overlaps between strategies that can kind of do both, or maybe they do a little bit more, a little bit one or the other, but there are definitely strategies that only kind of do one or only do another one. And so before we kind of jump into all of them, I just wanted to get your perspective on that, on this kind of like bifurcation of strategies between things that are intended or mainly work through our perception of the heat, and then things that are truly focused on controlling core temperature, and what are the pluses and minuses of both of those.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's exactly right as well. I mean, if you jump into a cold bath, well, that'll do both, right? You'll definitely get much cooler, and you'll definitely feel a lot cooler, right? And one of the things that we've chatted about as well before is menthol, whereas menthol
Yeah.
does not cool you down; it gives you the perception of feeling cool. So there's two very distinct and different things. There are different physiological responses happening. One is nothing physiological is happening other than obviously neurons firing in the skin, or if you're swallowing menthol telling you that you feel cool, but you're not cooling down whatsoever. Whereas yes, if you use high slurry ingestion or things like that, or even again cold water immersion, then you will get that physiological response. So it's probably, as you mentioned, kind of finding a way that if you have access to several of these things, how you can use them in combination to get the ideal or the optimal benefit from those things at different points in the race. And I think you highlight a very good point about an ultra distance race, which lasts a lot longer than any event in the Olympics, even the 50K race walks, for
Yeah.
example, where actually they're quite good actually the race walkers at using these strategies, because oftentimes it's a small loop and they can come back and get a slushy or get something to cool themselves down. But yes, using it in different points in the race. And another thing we talked about just offline before we started is about those ultra distance races and Western States. You start off in the morning, it's a bit cooler. So, do you really need a cooling strategy there? But yeah, throughout the race, if you get a bit lower altitude afterwards, then maybe you start needing a bit of cooling strategies, which also help, depending on which one you use, can help with hydration, which is another factor as well, right?
Well, and I think something that the listeners are probably thinking, and I'm thinking this as well, is that with some of the strategies, like we'll just take menthol as an example, not to pick on it, but it's a fairly well studied strategy now. And as you mentioned, what you're doing is you're essentially tricking your body into thinking that it's cooler. Let's just call spade a
That's right.
spade, right? It's not
Yeah.
actually cooler. You're just tricking your body into thinking that it's cooler. And that can be really effective in like a 40K time trial, right? Because it's a
Mhm.
finite amount of time. You can run the engine really hot. You can get to a super high core temperature for a very short period of time, but that is limiting. Um, some people are thinking in what my question specifically is there a risk of using those types of strategies in a longer distance event because you are
Mhm.
going to potentially override this mechanism that you should have in place of overheating? Is that a real risk that people need to start to think about when they're designing their strategies?
That's a good point, and I think you see that quite often in the literature. But I then there may be some literature, but I've never seen anything that suggests that if you put menthol on and you feel cooler, that you're going to have a dramatic increase in core temperature. Because one of the things we need to remember as well is that given that menthol doesn't actually do anything physiologically, there are some physiological limits to performance,
Right.
right? So if you're doing a time trial and you're on the limit, and you put menthol on, you might feel cooler and you might increase your work rate a little bit. But if you're on that limit, you're not going to increase it for very long, right? Or else your heart rate's
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
start going through the roof, and at some point you're going to have to slow down. So there's that, and then the other one is how long those effects last. So if you take menthol, either you put it on your skin, you have it as a gel, or whatever the case may be, and you feel cooler, and you do have that little surge in running speed or power output on the bike. Again, how long does it last? And then do you have to compensate for that afterwards? You know,
Yeah.
if you're redlining and you're kind of going a bit, I mean, obviously you wouldn't be redlining in an ultra distance race, but in like a 40K time trial, for the example you provided, if you're redlining, you go a bit too fast, then you might have to compensate and go a bit slower, then kind of catch back up. And how long does that effect last? So there's all those things I think that still need to kind of be investigated. And
Yeah.
the thing with many or most cooling strategies as well as the length of the effect, right? And we did a meta-analysis just recently, and I can send you if you link it if you're interested. And we looked at there's two types of exercise you can do in the lab, right? Like the constant load stuff and the self-paced stuff. So I say, okay, exercise at a constant work rate, so run for 15K an hour, and then we'll see what your responses are. Or I say complete a 30K time trial or a 15K time trial running. And we see that there's more of an effect on the constant load trials than the self-paced trials. Primarily, well, because of two reasons. One, they're mostly shorter. So the shorter the event, the more the effect, right? So if you're cooler, given that you're going to run or cycle for 30 minutes, then that effect obviously will be more powerful. But if you're doing 60, 90 minutes, then obviously that effect relative to the distance is not as important. There's also probably the effect of work rate. So if I say go at a constant speed, well, your work rate is fixed, your heat production is fixed. But if I say do a time trial, you're probably going to start at a much higher work rate and then you'll decrease. But given that you're producing a lot of heat from the beginning, then that effect of the cooling allows that. But then you also heat up more quickly. So there's all those kind of caveats. So if you're doing like a 12-hour race, well, obviously it doesn't really matter if for the first 30 minutes you feel a bit cooler because you still have to go quite longer. So that's where I guess the point comes in about using those different strategies throughout the race if it does get a bit hotter. So in terms of to circle back to your point about health and safety, there may be that effect of and it's been highlighted that yes, if you feel cooler, you might push harder and get more hyperthermic. But I've never seen evidence of that because I just think that the response is so transient. And if anything, your physiological responses will be like, actually, well, time out, you're going a bit too quick here. You can't hold that pace. Let's slow down, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I recognize the transient nature, the very quick, nature of those types of those types of interventions. I just think about it almost from a performance standpoint, where if you have all of these like inputs that are lasting for a short period of time, usually the disruption in that steady state activity that you're having, those small disruptions end up being a net negative to this constant what ends up, even though it's a self-paced activity, it's a pretty constant workload because you can only go so hard for these long periods
Exactly.
of
And that's
time.
what you want as well, right? When you're pacing, you want to
Exactly.
maintain it
Yeah.
steady. Yeah.
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 And so
Absolutely.
sometimes I think that these very specific narrowly focused transient types of interventions end up doing athletes a disservice because they cause this undulation in output. That's an I think statement. Let me just like
Yeah.
raise my hand there. But it makes sense to me when I'm trying to piece all of this together from a practical standpoint and trying to advise athletes on what to do is I'll always default to what creates the more consistent, stable situation. What are the interventions that keep homeostasis in place as much as possible versus causing, rapid disruptions, unless you need the rapid disruption. And we might talk about that almost from an
Yeah,
avoidance
that's right.
standpoint, right?
Yeah, if you see the finish line and you're not doing well, then yeah, pop some menthol and then you can sprint and
There you
collapse.
go.
Yeah.
There you go. Different scenario. Okay, so let's start out with some of the nutrition ones. So the things that you can ingest, right, versus
Yep.
put on you. We already talked about menthol a little bit as something that you can actually ingest, but one of the things that's been very topical recently has been ingesting either a cold beverage or you can do both. It's it's not they're not mutually exclusive. An
Mhm.
ice slurry beverage, and it's been really interesting to me, and I'm sure more interesting to you to see how this is actually like played out in the theater of sport in terms of
Yeah.
how much these different interventions have actually been used. And at Western States, we'll see the range. We will see people that go to the gas station that's right around the corner from the course and grab a slushy, right? Grab a high fructose corn syrup Slurpee from the gas station and bring it out to their runners. And then we will see deliberately designed, commercially available sports nutrition products that are intended to be consumed in a type of slushy format. You'll see that whole range of sophistication, for lack of a
Yeah.
better word. And so I was wondering, so out of these cold drinks and then ice slurry types of beverages, let's set the table a little bit on how they can actually work and then which ones might be a better choice for athletes in this type of race.
Yeah, but I guess both are, from a certain perspective, or both are pretty useful because one, they have the potential to cool you down. I guess depending on the temperature of the beverage, or at least cool you down, or potentially attenuate the rise or in core temperature and maintain it there. So some of them might not cool you down if it's not too cold. And the flip side of that is it provides hydration, right? And it's a medium to stay hydrated, and potentially have some electrolytes in there if you have sodium, for example, or even glucose and carbohydrates if you need them. So it's kind of a good bang for buck if it can cool you down, provide you some nutrition at the same time. But there's different, I guess, potential for cooling or different cooling power between obviously ingesting cold water and ingesting a slurry. So cold water would be something to the effect of 10 degrees to 24 degrees, whereas a slurry is 0 degrees, right? So it's cool. So the effect of the slurry is a lot more potent in terms of cooling you down or attenuating your rise in core temperature, because you have to convert. You're not just heating up fluid or water, but you have to convert ice into water, and then you're kind of heating that up. So the conversion of ice to water is 3 times more powerful in terms of cooling than just warming up water. So that's why those slurries are much more effective at kind of cooling you down. And there's different ways of using that. You can use it in terms of pre-cooling, and then you can use it in terms of per-cooling or mid-cooling or cooling during a race. So you can use that. And again, we use cooling in terms of a description of it, but it doesn't necessarily cool you down, right? If you're doing a race and you take a slurry, you'd have to ingest quite a bit for it to kind of cool you down. But what it might do is it might maintain your core temperature stable or prevent it from rising. We've done an intervention before where we used it for pre-cooling. So we used, I can't remember how much ice we provided. It was like 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body mass, and you ingested that within half an hour. So let's say you're 60 kilos, and it's 10, so you'd have to ingest 600 grams of ice in 30 minutes. And we were like rotating cold towels on the shoulders and the legs for half an hour. And it's not super fun, right? Because I mean, the athletes
Yeah,
have to drink
yeah,
this,
yeah,
and then they have that on
yeah,
it. And
yeah,
it cooled core temp by, I think, 0.2 or 0.3, which is not a ton. It's not a big
yeah,
Celsius. It's not a big
yeah,
decrease. But then if you go out afterwards and you do your warm up, well, then you're back to your normal core temp. You might be a bit lower than you would be normally if you had done a normal warm up, but it's not a massive reduction in core temperature. But still, if it makes you feel a bit cooler and your event is shorter and you have to produce a lot of heat or produce a lot of speed at the beginning, well, then that might be helpful. But there's definitely two ways or two kind of pathways of doing that. Yeah, I guess before, during, or together, really.
So some people have heard that the ice slurry solution interferes with your sweat mechanism, somehow blunts your sweat response somehow. And I wanted you to kind of like enlighten the audience of, first off, the context of that, like the research context of that, because you know that
Yeah,
very
yeah,
well, but then also bring it into a practical perspective where an athlete is actually competing in a real event outside a lab.
that's right.
And is that, you know where I'm going with this? And is
Yeah,
that
yeah, that's
something that we
exactly
need to
right.
is it something that we need to materially take into consideration?
That's right. So we have receptors obviously in our mouth and in our gut, I guess. So if you drink really cold beverages, it's kind of like it's the same thing as those as the to a certain degree as the menthol, right? So the menthol triggers those cold receptors, as does cold fluid or ice slurries. So when you ingest that, one particular study showed that yes, it can kind of cool you down or at least attenuate the rise in core temperature. But in hot, dry conditions, it kind of lowered sweat rate to a certain degree, or sweat output, so attenuated, I guess, evaporative heat loss to a certain degree. But I guess to come back to your point about practicality, what you have to balance then is how transient that reduction or that small reduction in sweat rate might be relative to the benefit of attenuating your rise in core temperature and also consuming fluids again. So to come back to my point before, you're still consuming fluids to a certain degree that will hydrate you. So it's kind of balancing that out, because one important side note as well is with dehydration, severe dehydration. So if you lose, in excess of 5, 6, 7% of your body mass, that will have a significant impact on your ability to sweat. So you're conserving a bit more fluid, you're sweating less, skin blood flow is less. So the more you dehydrate, the more you can compound or exacerbate the environmental conditions in terms of increasing your core temperature, because you're sweating less. So again, you kind of have to balance those things out. So if you're consuming a lot of slurries, yeah, it might affect your sweating, but it could also, cool you down. So you have to balance those, I guess, that relationship.
Well, then the other thing I was thinking about from a practical standpoint, and this is very specific to this race, but I don't think it's indifferent from a lot of other endurance activities. The sweat that you are actually producing is not the only liquid on your skin that you can use to cool you down. You can also use water from aid stations and water from your hydration pack and things like that. So this potential negative, even if we try to take it to the nth degree of how impactful that reduction in sweat rate actually is, I kind of come back to the practical aspect of it is does it really actually make a difference, because you've got all this other water on your body from other places?
That's exactly right. That's a very good point as well. So, and I guess just to go back to sweating, like those beads of sweat or those beads of water that are on your skin, they obviously need to evaporate from the skin to cool you down. So they cool the skin, and then obviously the blood in your skin kind of goes back to the central circulation and cools you down, or at least again attenuates the rise in core temp. But you're right. If it's really dry, so if it's very humid, we'll be probably saturated with sweat anyway. So a lot of it will be dripping, so we'll get dehydrated. But in hot, dry conditions, you might find that you might think, oh, geez, I'm not sweating. What's going on? That's just because the sweat's evaporating very readily and very well. So you're absolutely right. In those cases, you can dump some water on your head, on your skin, and so forth. And those beads of water, if they evaporate, that's the same thing as sweat. Essentially, they will cool you down. So you're right to put it in the context of that ice slurry situation. If you have a transient reduction in evaporative heat loss capacity, because you're sweating less and you're producing less beads. But then if it's dry, just putting water on your skin, then you kind of compensate for it that way. There might be a reduction in skin blood flow, but as long as skin temperature is still elevated, you will evaporate those beads of sweat.
So menthol ice slurries for everybody. That's what we should be serving at aid stations. These kind of events. Is that what you're saying? Is that what
Yeah.
we're going to
Well, the
endorse?
other thing too is, yeah. Well, the other thing too is, obviously, and I'm sure you know and your listeners know that you wouldn't try something for the first time. So we're not recommending someone just pounds the ice slurries back next weekend and just smashes the menthol, because there could be gut issues, right? I mean, because pounding a lot of slurries back might slow down your digestion. You might have too much water. Then running around, obviously, with too much water, I'm sure many people have experienced that. It's not a pleasant experience. Cycling is not too bad because you don't have that kind of bouncing up and down. So it comes back to being well prepared for the race, having mitigation strategies in place that you've trialed, that you know you can tolerate. Menthol is another one. You don't want to pound back a bunch of menthol and then have some GI disruption, because then your race is over, right?
Well, and to bring it back to a more serious point, that is something that that you actually do see in the ice slurry research is some sort of commentary around the athletes who, for whatever reason, they just don't tolerate it as well. They get a, brain freeze, they get a headache,
That's
they
right.
get disruptions within their digestive tract, whether it's in their esophagus or in their stomach because of the I guess it's because of maybe the absolute temperature, maybe the difference in temperature between the warm air and what they're actually taking in. It's not something unless you just absolutely really need it that you should be specifically deploying on race day. You should have some degree of familiarity with it.
That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. Just trying it in a long run beforehand. And I mean, the ideal scenario obviously is that you try these things in kind of a similar condition for a good length. Obviously, not maybe 100 miles, but something similar. So because the way that your gut responds 6, 7, 8 hours into a race might be different than the first 2, 3 hours. So if ideally you can experience that, that's something as well that people might want to try.
Okay. So we went through the ice slurry thing, the ice slurry gate, ice slurry debate, and we went through menthol a little bit. Let's talk about things that people can put on their body. Ice, water, ice packs. There's all different types of commercial like delivery systems. And before
Mhm.
we get into them like specifically, just an overview of what they're trying to accomplish. I mean, it seems like, yeah, it's trying to make you cooler, right? We're trying to improve like either evaporative cooling or we're bringing something cold onto the surface of the skin to give a bigger temperature gradient to work with. But can you just describe generally what all of these things are trying to do to keep people cool?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, it's just the ideal is to keep people cool, other than menthol, which again is the sensation. But the idea there is, depending on the cooling power of the medium that you're using, you want to either lower core temperature, lower skin temperature. You don't really want to lower muscle temperature, which is, I guess, the caveat with ice baths. If you stay in there too much, then you lower muscle temperature, and it might not be at the ideal temperature for performance. I guess from an ultra distance perspective, it doesn't matter too much because you're not going to start off sprinting. So that's, I guess, the caveat with that. But yeah, that's the idea. So either you cool internally or you cool externally. So if you put something on your skin, what you're trying to do there is, I guess, cool the skin. And by cooling the skin, you're going to bring that cooler blood back to the central circulation, which again might lower your core temperature or prevent it from increasing too quickly. But I guess the important thing with a lot of these is the surface area that you're actually cooling. So you want a large surface area, you want a cooling power that's strong, and you want to apply it for a certain amount of time. A lot of the things that you can apply, other than water, that you can apply on your skin, you want them on there for a good 20 minutes. As you mentioned, you could have ice vests, you could have phase change material. So if you could have something that kind of goes on your skin, like a vest that kind of wicks sweat even more, or based on it, if you put it in cold air, in a cooler, for example, and you put it on, like the time it changes its phases, kind of keeps you cool. That's probably a bit more quicker and less potent than an ice vest, which obviously, if you put directly on your skin, then might last longer as well. With those things as well, you have to be careful with balancing how long you put it on your skin, and then at which point it no longer provides a benefit and becomes a barrier for evaporative heat loss, and how heavy it is. Like if it's something with ice that melts and then drips down, well, yes, you might be wet, but then you might be less heavy. But if it's just an extra 5 pounds of ice that cools you initially, and then eventually cold turns into water, then you're running around with 5 extra pounds of water that you're just running around with, that's providing nothing, and with the vest preventing you from cooling down. So it's kind of finding those happy mediums with all of these cooling strategies. And again, it comes back to the surface area, cooling power, and length that it's applied, I guess, to the skin or to
Well,
the body, I guess.
I want to go into each one of those, but I'm going to start with the cooling power piece, kind of the one in the middle.
Yeah.
A lot of people are going to think about this in terms of I'm gonna rephrase it a little bit and then let you clarify, being the expert here, in terms of the temperature gradient. So the temperature difference between the surface of the skin and the thing that you are putting on it, whether it's ice or water or a cooling pack or whatever. But what do you mean by cooling power? Is it that plus something else, or is it something more sophisticated?
Well, it's that and the time, right? So you might have something that has a big gradient, because obviously the bigger the gradient, the more heat you'll lose to that medium. So this works via conduction, right? So we talked initially about the evaporation of sweat and convection, which is airflow going across your body. But this is conduction, which is when things are in contact and heat is transferred across. So if you put something in contact to your skin, and your skin is hotter, then you'll lose heat to that medium that you're in contact with. So the greater the gradient between that, the greater the potential is for losing heat. So I guess the power is both the difference in temperature, but also the length, right? Because you could have something that has a gradient of 5 degrees and something that has a gradient of 20 degrees. But if something stays at that 5-degree gradient and you put it on that skin for 20 minutes, obviously it's going to have more cooling power than something that has a greater gradient, but for 2 minutes, for example, right? So it's a kind of a combination of those two things. So how much of a difference is there between the skin and the medium that you're using, and how long you put it on your skin? And not that I want to come back to the other one, but also how much surface area you have, right? So if I'm cooling down this much area or my entire back, obviously the entire back's going to provide more cooling power. So it's kind of all of them together, really.
Okay, so we can talk about surface area now too as well. And that to most people it's going to be fairly self-explanatory. The more skin that you can cover, the more heat that you're going to be able to dissipate. But are there targeted areas within our skin that have the potential to dissipate or to transfer more heat, either due to the proximity of blood vessels, or they're just hotter in general? Can you kind of like paint that picture as well? Because we do see selectively certain areas of the body that people just preferentially like to cool. You know, I was going over this with one of our athletes earlier today. And we're going to remove it from a sport context just to make it really simple. When you've got COVID and you've got a fever, you put a cold pack on your forehead because it feels really good, right? It just feels good. That's a very hot area of your body. It feels really good, but you're not putting it on like, your forearm or your bicep or anything like that. You put it on your forehead for a reason. And so using that as a little bit of logic, are there, within this whole proposition of trying to cover or trying to get as much surface area as possible, are there strategic areas that athletes can kind of look at to apply more of this cooling power to that would result in a bigger advantage?
Well, we can maybe kind of parallel this with people that have exertional heat stroke, right? So you want to cool them down very quickly. So the idea there, just a bit of a side note, is, we want to cool them down very quickly and then transport them to the hospital. And ideally you put them in a cold bath and cool them down. If not, if you have ice packs and things like that, you're right in what you mentioned initially. You might want to put it in areas that are closer in proximity to arteries and things like that, or highly vascularized areas. So you might put that, under an armpit or in the legs, just in the groin area and things like that, which obviously when you're racing, those areas are not really easy to access and try and cool down. So people do the back of the neck or the forehead, as you said. But if you think of how much surface area relative to your whole body this provides, or the back of your neck provides, it's not much, right? So in terms of cooling power, it's little to nothing, right? You'll feel better, but it's not going to cool you down and not really going to attenuate your rise in core temperature. And again, I have to be careful when I say this, because cooling you down, you need a lot of cooling power, and attenuating the rise in core temperature, that's more so when you start exercising, cycling or running. If you have a lot of cooling power, then you might not increase as much. But if you're doing a long race, your core temperature is probably going to go up and then stabilize. So if anything, that might not change, or might change a little bit, but it just might reduce your heart rate a little bit. So if you put something on your skin, you might reduce skin temperature, and then that might reduce skin blood flow, and then you're allowing to have a bit more blood in the central circulation. So your heart rate might go down a little bit, but you might not notice that your core temperature is going down. But if you were to measure skin temperature, maybe your skin temperature. Going down, but that's a bit harder to measure, especially in a race. So there is that balance. And again, if you go back to those more targeted interventions or more targeted areas, they don't provide a ton of cooling power. One of the things you did mention, though, is like forearms and hands. So maybe that's one thing, that it's a lot larger surface area. It's well vascularized. So in the military, and I think in firefighting as well, they do do that. So they have like these tubs of water and ice. And if you get to, like, for example, in running, if you get to an aid station, there is that, you could plunge, your forearms into that for, 5 minutes or something like that. And that would help with cooling a little bit more
The
so than something on your forehead and your back of your neck for sure.
the hands as well. I mean, this is a trick. I'm using trick in air quotes here that only the YouTube people can kind of see. But a lot of ultra marathoners, even before we had a lot of really good heat research, would like use this strategy of is they would just carry ice in their hands out of an aid station, and once again they're using their experience of this feels good. It cools me down to have ice in my hands in a really hot day. They're not consuming it. The hands aren't that big of a surface area, right? Even for people with really
Yeah,
big hands, let's be honest, like that's not that big of a surface
of
area.
course. Yeah.
But people would do that. But what you're saying is there might be something to that just because of the vascularization in those areas specifically.
Yeah, that, and if you dump the forearms, obviously you get more than the hand, right? You get the forearm and above the elbow, and because depending on how much obviously body fat you have, you can it's an area you can cool down relatively quickly, and then once you start running again, pumping the arms, that kind of cooler blood goes back to the central circulation and might cool you down slightly, or again, kind of make you feel cooler, or at least cool the skin so that your heart rate might be lower to improve your cardiac output.
Yeah. Whenever all these different strategies like start to emerge, I always go back to the environments where we're trying to cool athletes down that you can control the most. And the prototypical example that everybody's going to see in the Olympics and everybody's going to see in the next Olympics that's really hot or however it actually works out are the cooling vests, where all of the cold is right up against your torso, right up against your stomach. And sure, the vest is clunky and it's not practical to kind of use out in the field. But what that's telling you is you're taking advantage of one, the big thermal difference between the ice packs or the ice that's in the vest and your skin, and also simultaneously the large area of your torso and your stomach and your back to where you can get a really reasonable thermal power or cooling power with that type of intervention.
That's exactly right. And I think, well, even in a few weeks, the Tour de France will start. And when they do
Yeah,
time trials,
yeah,
what they do is they go in the shade, they put a fan in front of the riders because they're warming up on a trainer, and they put the vests on, which again, if you parallel to running, it's a lot easier to do that in
yeah,
cycling because you're
yeah.
not moving. But with running, what you might find is that athletes are warming up as they do normally, but then after the warm up in the waiting area, they put that ice vest. And as you said, because the ice vest, depending on where the ice packs are positioned in the ice vests in the front and in the back, then yeah, you can have a lot of cooling power. There's obviously different ice vests and different, I guess, grades of how well they provide that cooling power, depending on what I guess the garment is made of and how close and how cool that ice pack can actually cool the skin. Because if you have a super thick garment, then obviously the cooling power is not going to be very, very strong. But if you can go right against the skin, or at least a thin jersey, because they don't take off their jerseys in cycling, and even running, you probably keep a singlet on. But yeah, if you can cool a lot of the torso and the back, as you said, or it's a bigger surface area and does provide that cooling power.
I'm glad that you mentioned textiles. This wasn't on our outline, but we're going to talk about it anyway. There's any number of opinions on the right fabric to, and I'm going to set out the prototype here just so that we're not going to like mix metaphors or anything like that. You're going to get wet at an aid station and you're going to run out of that aid station dripping wet. And then that water is going to be kind of what cools you down. So there's any different number of opinions on what the fabric should be or what fabric you should wear. Should you wear something that is highly wicking, like like super technology? We're going to put the most wicking fabric in the world there. Even something with holes, people will cut holes out of their shirt, to get like more airflow and things like that. And then honestly, you will see the exact opposite side of that camp, like the exact opposite of it, of where you want a garment that retains the moisture as much as possible, cotton, right? You want it to retain the moisture as much as possible in order to keep the athlete wet. And it kind of is just to let you in on the inside of some of this ultra marathon nonsense that, we get to see every June in Olympic Valley. It is a very polarizing debate, like to the point where people get mad at each other for like one opinion or the other. And so here we go. We can opine on this. Garment technology,
Yeah.
does it even matter? And then what are certainly we can notice the differences, but what would be the situational differences on when one garment would outperform another one in terms of its cooling
Mm.
power?
Well, I need to preface this by saying that I am not a garment expert by any means. So this is just a little bit of my knowledge and opinion kind of together. But we did do a study a few years ago, and this was some colleagues in Greece, and we looked at different kind of garments. Like one was like a cooling garment, a wicking one, and a cotton, and there wasn't much difference in that study. And I think what's important as well is um, using the garment in the proper context. So those wicking garments are very good, but at some point, if you're running for a long time in a hot environment, then the garment becomes saturated with sweat anyways. So I guess its wicking properties at that point, do they even matter? Because it's
Yeah.
all wet and sticking to you and so forth. So I think a cotton shirt would be the same thing. So I think at some point, it probably doesn't matter all that much, to be honest, right? Because the properties of the garments and how they may be helpful are kind of nullified just by the fact that they're completely wet and sticking to you. I think a garment that's wet at some point will become the same temperature of depending on the environment of your
Right.
skin. So there's not going to be much of a gradient. And then if you keep putting water on it, I don't know if it'll help much with the evaporation of sweat anyways, because it's going to be fully saturated. So I think at some point when those garments are fully saturated with water, I don't know how much more helpful it becomes. But again, that's more my personal view, I guess.
But you want the water to evaporate, or you want whatever is on the garment to eventually evaporate, whether it's water, your sweat, a combination of everything, a sports drink that you accidentally poured over your
Yes,
head, like, because that's what creates the temperature gradient is the evaporation of those water droplets.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. But again, depending on the garment, I mean, water evaporating from your skin is better than water evaporating from
Right.
the garment, because then it's the garment's the interface with you and the environment, not your skin. So there is that to consider. But yes, you want it to evaporate, unless you have very cold water and you have the opportunity to kind of put cold water on yourself and on your garment periodically, that it stays cooler than your skin. Then you can provide that cooling power. But I can't imagine that would be the case in an ultra endurance rate. You wouldn't have, aid stations every kilometer or something.
Yeah, we will. I don't think we're gonna solve this here. But needless to say, there are people that are going to be listening that are like, they have the perfect solution. Like the holes in the garment should be exactly here and exactly there, and it should be this, perfect fabric and things like that. And I'm of the opinion of it probably doesn't matter all that much.
Yeah, well, I mean, if they're interested and have the funding, then just let me know. We can definitely test it in
All
the
right.
lab.
All right, there we go. We'll strive for that. Okay. So speaking of technology, there have been a number of products that have kind of come out on the marketplace, and the triathletes have made this famous now. They're always first adopters. They're first at the table with anything new. That's why we love them. The one that people are going to be the most familiar with are these funky looking headbands that have these squares on them. There's a few different manufacturers that actually
Mm,
make them now. And the claim of these manufacturers is that it increases the effective surface area of the forehead. What's going on here with these different devices? Because first off, they're not cheap. They're a couple $100 for a headband, right? A sweatband. I'm always thinking of the old school basketball players that had,
yes.
the
Yeah,
sweatbands and
yeah,
things
yeah.
like that. God bless Bill Walton, who just passed away, was really famous for
That's right.
rocking those. But what's going on here with these $200 headbands? Is there something here that athletes need to pay attention to, and what's the right context for it?
Well, I want to say there's probably not much going on because, again, if we come back to what we were saying before about cooling power, surface area, and so forth, the forehead is not a massive area. I should say, I mean, if you buy one, you wear it, makes you feel cool, and you feel you perform better, well, then that's fine if you perform better. I haven't had a chance to do a deep dive into this, but I guess the first thing I would do is that I would look on the website to see if there's actual research that's been done around that. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to do that, but oftentimes you see a lot of products with big claims. Some of them actually have, like a research link and say, hey, we've commissioned some research and they found this, which is the product that I would probably trust the most. I would read the research carefully
Of course.
beforehand to see, but if there's no research behind it and it's just claims, and they haven't objectively been looked at in the lab, then I would be a bit careful about some of the claims and how accurate those claims are. And again, I haven't looked at this product, so I can't comment, but just from a purely cooling cooling perspective, and again, as we talked about it before, the cooling power of that surface area, how cold it is, how long it stays cold, it's unlikely to kind of cool you down per se.
But still, it could potentially have an impact on your sensation, your thermal sensation, right? Or it could
Yeah, again,
improve
it's
your
like
thermal sensation as opposed to just dumping water on your head because there's something to do with the device itself or the garment itself.
exactly, and it comes back to what we were saying before, and you summarized about, there's the physiological and then there's the perceptual,
Yeah.
right? So physiologically, maybe not much is going on, but perceptually, if it improves your thermal comfort, your thermal sensation, lowers your rating of perceived exertion, despite your heart rate not changing, well, then maybe you can perform a little bit better. Will that catch up to you, as we were talking about before, if you accelerate a bit too much? Potentially. But it is a perceptual thing, potentially a bit more than a cooling thing, kind of like menthol, I would suggest. But again, I haven't done a deep dive into this product, but it would have to, it would have to cool you down a lot. And in that area, yeah, that might be very uncomfortable if it were to cool you down quite
Yeah.
a lot.
Okay,
So
so
are
we're
you
gonna
aware on the website if there's any research
they
on
they they do have some certain manufacturers do have some research on there, and I have gone into it, and it kind of just points out what you were just saying is that the area isn't the area from a functional perspective isn't really increased all that much to be a big thermal sink, but
yeah,
there could be some perceptual changes that if that's what you need for a race. Once again, this is why the context matters, right?
exactly.
If you
Yeah.
are looking to improve your sensation of temperature somehow to use that ergogenically, fair game, like absolutely.
Hmm.
If you need
And
to
even with
actually if you need to reduce your core temperature, probably not fair game.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And again, in an ultra distance race, as we were talking about before, the race profile changes quite a lot. So maybe it's just using it
One
strategically.
piece. Yep.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily to speed up, but even just to maintain
Yeah.
a particular pace, just because you want to feel cooler.
Yeah.
Well, then maybe, yeah, by all means, if you find that helps, then yeah, go for it.
I'll take just a quick break here before we go on to the last topic. Since we are bringing up Western states, in advance of the race, there actually is a really great weather profile that I believe the race actually produces it and puts it out, of where they will give the temperature estimations in like time blocks for each of the aid stations. And
Okay.
once the temperature starts to materialize, which this is going to come out on the Monday before the race, and usually that's Tuesday or Wednesday. And once those temperature profiles start to actually be real and not just wild guesses, which is where we're at right now. Once they become real, I absolutely advise athletes to look at that and to look at them individually, because the temperature differences are so big. You're going to use a whole host of different interventions, different hydration strategies, different amounts of fluid that you need to take in, depending upon those wild temperature fluctuations. And one of the things that trips athletes up the most in Western states is the fact that they have to just simply change their hydration requirements from the beginning of the race to the middle of the race to the end of the race so wildly.
Mm.
It's not a constant 500 milliliters per hour. Sometimes it's 3 or 4x from where you actually started with. So for all you athletes out there that are training in hot weather races, look at the race section by section, because you're probably going to want to do something in some cases drastically differently on certain sections of the courses compared to others.
Good point.
Okay, so we talked about small surface areas. Let's go to the biggest surface areas, kind of like the final topic here. And this is full ice water immersion. And I'll give a little bit of a kind of an anecdotal story to kind of like lead this off. The incomparable Scott Jurek, who won Western States 7 times, and he also won Badwater, I believe, twice. He was very famous during the Badwater Ultramarathon for having one cooler in his crew vehicle that was specifically dedicated to an ice dunk. It was a gigantic cooler. I think it was like 120 liters or something like that. Like, he's a big guy, 6'4", tall guy. So it's the big long torso, right? And not a standard
Yeah,
cooler
yeah.
is gonna fit his whole body in. And he used to get in the thing like a coffin. He would cross his arms and he would get his whole upper body immersed all the way down to his shorts in this ice water slurry, and he'd stay in there for kind of as long as tolerable, and then get out and then go down the Badwater course again. And there's all kinds of good research on this whole water immersion piece of it. And there's also practical elements of it. So this being kind of like the biggest intervention that you can kind of like throw out
Yeah.
during, let's kind of discuss like how powerful can this actually be? And then also how transient it actually might be during the race, since you might be deploying it at one specific point or another.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's as you said, the most powerful cooling intervention. I'd be interested to know. Do you know roughly how long he stayed in there? I'm just out of curiosity, to be honest.
I remember it was, I mean, it was not more than a couple of minutes, but he
Yeah.
would get he
Okay.
would get in, he'd hold his breath, he'd hold his nose and
Yeah.
try to stay submerged in it for a little bit. And you can only do that for so long of a period of time. Then you
Yeah.
come
Of course.
come back
Yeah.
up for air. So basically his from his shoulders or his neckline to his waist was submerged, or maybe like mid thigh. And then
Yeah.
I remember him staying in there. Scott, I'm sorry if you're listening to this and I'm totally butchering it. But I remember him staying in there for a couple of minutes, essentially,
Yeah.
on
Okay.
whenever he would deploy it, which would be several times during the race.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I mean, I talked about initially about cold water immersion and being careful not to cool muscle temperature too much. But again, in this context, it doesn't matter too much because you're not, again, sprinting. You don't need to have that higher muscle
Yeah.
temperature because higher muscle temperatures, you need to produce more power, more speed. But no one's coming out of the gate sprinting in an ultra distance race. So, and the fact that he didn't put his legs in there as well is probably not a bad idea, right? Because you cool the torso and so forth, and you cool down. But yeah, it does provide a tremendous amount of cooling power. Just a bit of an anecdote as well. During my master's, 25 years ago now, we were looking at cooling power of water. And I would run, I think it was 4 trials we did, and I would run in an environmental chamber until my rectal temperature got to 40 degrees. So I had an esophageal probe in, rectal probe in, a probe in my ear for tympanic temperature. And as you may know, rectal temperature responds more slowly than esophageal temperature. So anyways, when I got to 40 degrees, I jumped into baths of different temperatures. And if I remember correctly, because it was a while ago, I think it was like 18, 12, maybe 8 and 4. And I remember in 4 degrees, there was ice blocks floating around.
Yeah.
And from 40, and I think it was 38.5 we needed to get down to, it took about 5, 7 minutes. So
Oh, wow.
that's just how quickly, if I remember
Yeah, yeah.
correctly, but that's how quickly it occurs. So there's obviously the colder the water, the more the cooling power. So you definitely can get very, very cold. So in something like a race like this, it's probably not a bad idea to jump in. You probably don't have to have 4-degree water, but anything under 15 degrees or something like Celsius will cool you down. Again, if you want to put your legs in there or not is something that you might want to try, because I guess if the water temperature is a bit higher, it probably doesn't matter too much if your legs are in there. But if not, just kind of sit back, as the example you were providing, up to the torso. I don't think you need to put your head in there, but up to the, I guess, shoulder height, and cover your up to your thighs. That will provide some cooling power. Then you come out of there, you start running again, you'll feel cooler. And if you can do that periodically, that might be helpful, especially if you're down in the valley and it gets a lot hotter, for example, in different races.
But part of the reason it's so powerful is because it's a big mass of just a big mass of water that you're submerging yourself in, which has the capacity to transfer a lot of the heat. Am I understanding that correctly? Like
To
that's one of
absorb
the
the heat.
to absorb the heat, right?
Yeah, that's right. So because it's, well, again, going back to power, to cooling power, it's a large surface area. I mean, you're cooling from
The
your neck
entire
basically
thing.
down to
Yeah.
your thigh. And then water obviously conducts heat very well. So you absorb a lot of the heat. So you're not gaining cool, you're losing heat to the water. And the best thing to do as well is to kind of circulate or move the water a little bit. Because if the water stays still, then you might have kind of a thin layer of warmer water around your skin that then you lose heat a bit less. So if you're moving the water, it's kind of that convective flow.
Yeah.
Same thing with air and water. So if you move that, then you'll lose even a bit more heat. So it's the temperature gradient, the surface area, and the cooling power of moving that cold water.
So a lot of people are thinking about the magnitude of the event of the intervention versus the amount of benefit that they actually get from it. And I think there's kind of like two performance contexts that we can think about here.
Yes.
The first one is like abortive. So you are trying to get an athlete from being in a hyperthermic state back to a normal temperature, so just they can function and kind of get down the trail, right? That's where you're just throwing everything. Every solution that we just talked about, especially the ones that create big temperature gradients, have big cooling power, we're going to throw it at it. But on the performance side, this is actually where it gets kind of interesting, because there's the math is really fuzzy, right? We can do everything, we can do things in a lab and say, okay, so for every 1/10 of 1 degree Celsius core body temperature increase, it affects performance by this much. But then when you overlay the intervention and then what the intervention costs, you're sitting in an ice coffin for 3 minutes, right? Like it kind of becomes it just becomes really, really cloudy in terms of what you're actually getting out of it. So I would kind of like turn that over to you from a practical standpoint. Is there anything that you can, like any sort of commentary that you can provide in terms of like what are the best interventions, bang for buck, that both will improve performance as well as don't cost a lot of time, energy, and effort into the whole thing? Like what do you have to say about that if you're actually advising athletes out on the course to get the most out of it?
Oh, that's a tough one to
I
answer, to be
know.
honest,
That's
because
why
I
we're
think
ending with it. I'm ending with the tough one
yeah,
here, Julian.
because I think you'd have to put the context of what kind of, like, what's the environment, like the ambient conditions, the prevailing conditions the athlete is in, and what their strain, physiological strain. So how hot are they? What's their heart rate? Because that kind of provides the reserve, or the understanding of how much faster they can run, or how can they maintain their pace, right? So let's put this in a worst case scenario. It's very, very hot. The athlete is struggling to maintain their pace. Then yes, it's probably worth jumping in 3 to 5 minutes in a cold bath, as we were saying, to kind of lower your core temperature, to make you feel better, maybe get some nutrition in. That's easier to get when you're not necessarily on the run. That might provide some benefit. In that, for how long afterwards, again, that's a bit debatable, because it depends on how hard they start running afterwards, how hot the environment is. But then that trade-off becomes, okay, well, at what point, as you were saying before, at what point do I stop and do this and lose 3 to 5 minutes, relative to if I slow down slightly but I'm still running, because 3 to 5 minutes could be a kilometer, right? Well, maybe not three, but closer to 5 minutes. Could be a kilometer. So you're a kilometer down the road, but you're going slower. So how much time does it take you? But for an ultra distance race, maybe you catch up. But by the time you catch up, the effect of the cooling might have worn off anyway. So it's kind of it is a very good question. So I think it's weighing up all those situational factors. And that reminds me of kind of quantifying the thermal environment which an individual is. So that thermal environment is basically the ambient conditions. And that's provided by ambient temperature, globe temperature, so the effect of radiative heat from the sun, airflow from wind, and relative humidity. And when you look at temperature, so you talked a bit about the Western states providing an indication of weather conditions coming up. So one thing to think about is when you look at ambient temperature, that's always measured in the shade. So if you look at ambient temperature, let's say it's going to be, again, in Celsius, 35 degrees, which is hot. That's hot, but it's measured in the shade. And when you measure globe temperature, that's like a temperature measured inside a globe, which takes into account radiative heat. And oftentimes in Celsius, again, I apologize for that, it can always easily be 10, 12, maybe even 15 degrees hotter.
Big difference.
Right?
Big difference.
Big difference.
Big difference.
Yeah. Exactly. So so there's that perspective. But then the other perspective is the metabolic heat production that the individual is producing. So the faster you run, the more heat you produce. And then the other factor, so the other personal factor, other than the 4 environmental ones, and 2 personal ones. So the heat you're producing and the clothing that you're wearing. So all of those things together with will hopefully help you make a decision about whether you should slow down and run slower, or jump into a hot bath and all those things, or help you decide anyways. Because I think it's a difficult one.
It's tricky because here's what I'm going to just verbalize this as I'm thinking about it, and you can provide commentary on the top of it. So obviously, the hotter the environment, whether we're measuring it in the ambient temperature or globe temperature, the hotter the environment, the more you're going to want to use interventions that potentially cost you time because it's worth it. Where those lines of demarcation are, that's why coaches kind of make their money, because we make these educated guesses based on kind of what we know and what the research is actually telling us. But then the
Yeah, and maybe
second
a
part,
side note to that. So just, but there's a side
yeah,
note to that as well is pacing, right?
yes, that's
Because
exactly what I
pacing
was
is
going to
obviously.
say. Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, you can go ahead then.
No. Go ahead, because
Yeah, well, I
we're
was
thinking
going to
the
say,
same thing there.
yeah, because I mean that's the important bit, right? Because well, another important aspect, just about learning to pace and being patient in races. So if it is hot, well, maybe you slow down, and then when it gets to a point where you can pick up the pace because it's cooling down or whatever the case may be, then that's quite important because again, part of that whole thermal environment is pacing, which is associated with metabolic heat production. So if you slow down, you're producing less heat. You might not necessarily have to cool down as much. So combining all of those things, obviously with nutrition being an important one for ultra distance races, I think the combination of all those things is quite important.
So Rob Cryer, he's won the Western States 100 twice. He was very famous for having a pacing strategy. And maybe this is a little bit too granular, but he won the race. So how are you going to criticize him? Of where he would speed up when it was shaded and slow down when he was in the sun, which sometimes can happen on like, every 10 or 20 meters or something like that. You go through 10 meters of shade and then 10 meters of sun and then 10 meters shade. And he would kind of like he would kind of like micro pace his effort out so that it was just a little bit harder during the shade part, a little bit easier during the sunny part. But to your point, you can actually take an advantage. You can take advantage of that. This dovetails into my other thought is that the elite athletes who are running the race in a shorter duration, right? The elite athletes will finish in 15 hours and the cutoff is 30 hours, right? So they can do it at a much higher intensity because they are better and that the duration of
That's
the
right.
event is shorter as well. They are actually better candidates or maybe even earlier stage candidates for like the advanced stage interventions because they are producing more heat because they have the opportunity to run harder, yet they're the ones that are going to also want to take the most risk
Mm.
because they don't want the downtime. So it's this interesting like conundrum that they're kind of in terms of what to actually take on board and what to just like roll the dice with.
Mm. That's a very good point because I was reading something recently, and if you kind of compare marathons and ultra marathons, the hotter it gets in a marathon, the more that affects the slower runners because they're
Right.
out in those
Right.
conditions for longer.
Right.
But in contrast, the hotter it is in an ultra marathon, the more it affects the elite athletes because they'll spending more time in the heat, whereas the slower runners might spend more time in the evening and so forth and overnight. So it's so to your point, yeah, it's an interesting one because they're more affected by the heat. So do they gamble and not do any cooling, or do they gamble and do some cooling to slow down to potentially benefit? And again, it depends on that whole situation of how hot is it, how hard am I
Yeah.
going. And I mean, heart rate's always a good indicator. Heart rate and RPE. So if you're finding that, oh man, it's fine because they probably have a pace that they know that they can hold, or they may go by heart rate. But if you kind of compare, okay, my pace relative to heart rate. Well, I'm going at the proper heart rate, but my pace is slower, or I'm going the proper pace and my heart rate's higher. Maybe I need to cool down. Maybe I need to slow down. So it's kind of in the context in the race, kind of making those decisions on the fly. And maybe, before you were highlighting about having different things at different hydration points within the race, well, maybe you have different strategies for the same hydration place in the race, or the same kind of not hydration place, but the aid station in the
Yeah.
race, depending on how you're going and how the environment is.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think you can tune it and I do think the elite field is getting sophisticated enough to where they are finally tuning that based on all of those different parameters. And I was going over this with one of my athletes just this morning, who's in the elite field. It even influences the equipment choices.
Mm.
So do I want to take a pack that is potentially going to insulate me more, but I have more fluid carrying capacity? Or do I want to use hand bottles because it kind of frees up everything and I can dump stuff over my head? Like it's just a really interesting kind of decision matrix here. All right, we're gonna let you go, man. And we ended up on the hard question there. I always like
Yeah,
to do
yeah.
that with guests, just throw the grenade in right at the end. I can't tell you how much just from me to you, I really appreciate your work. I've referenced it countless times. The review paper that we used is a little bit of an outline I'm going to make. It's freely available. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. I do encourage everybody to check it out. It's a heavy one.
Yes, it is. Yes.
It's not a light one. There's a lot of, how many references are in this thing? I'm just going to find that. That's always a good choice or a
I
good,
think it's 1,067.
oh my God,
I
1,067
think.
references. Holy cow. We'll just call it an even thousand,
Yeah.
Julian. But just to kind of just to bring my point up again, man, I just really appreciate how thorough you are in these areas, and also how we can distill it down to something that people who are racing, literally racing this weekend, I hope they got something, but not something to where they're going to drastically change their plans. It's kind of a kind
Yeah.
of a love hate,
Yeah. Be
love hate
careful
here,
with that
man.
one. Yeah. I mean, as always, I mean, this is our second time having a chat. It's always a pleasure. So thank you for inviting me. And I hope, yeah, people get some benefit from our
Cool.
discussion. It's always a pleasure. And good luck to everyone racing as well.
Of course. Where can people find more about you and your work, and then what's coming up if they want to volunteer for some of the studies that we teased out a little bit on
Yeah.
garments or
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever? Where can people find you, man?
We're in Australia, so if you want to be a participant, you're free to come down
Nice.
and be a participant. So I'm at the University of Canberra. I'm at the Research Institute for Sport and Exercise. So feel free to jump on the website, jump online, I should say, and have a look. I run the Environmental Physiology Lab, so we have a climate chamber where we do a lot of our work, and some of the stuff that will come out very soon is stuff on heat acclimation. So looking at the difference between dry and humid heat acclimation. Is it
Mm,
specific? Does it, or, if you acclimate, is it fine? And we're finding that there's not major differences, which is probably not a surprise, given that we can't put people in there for super, super long periods for acclimation. We're doing some work as well now with the Australian Sport Institute, and which comes back to, I guess, the discussion we had initially about acclimation and acclimatization, and modifying the, I guess, traditional optimal recommendations for elite athletes, and how do they put that in their regimented training program. So we're doing that for women, for men, for Paralympic athletes as well, and trying to find out how that works. And we're also looking at a bit of a comparison between sexes as well, because that's an area of contention at the moment between men and women about how they acclimatize or acclimate. Is it as quick for men as it is for women, and so forth? So we're doing quite a big study there, looking at neuromuscular function, cardiac function, and so forth. So lots of stuff to look at down the line. So yeah, if you're interested, fire off an email as well. The email's in the paper. So happy to chat about stuff like this, obviously, with people.
awesome, man. Well, we'll have to bring you or one of your colleagues back on as these things start to dribble out, because already I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of want to know if this intervention versus that intervention works, better or worse, or is it different for men or women? And the practical piece of it that you guys are working on with AIS is what, as a coach, we are always the most supremely interested in, is how do we take all this stuff and actually do it with an athlete who's actually training and got all these other things going on in a quote unquote, I'll use optimal in air quotes, quote unquote, optimal setting. Those are the $1 zillion questions that we always kind of want answers to.
Well, you might hear from us, because one of the things we want to do is a survey as well, and send out to coaches that
Oh,
are working
awesome.
with athletes to see how they implement those things. So
Oh, cool.
yeah, stay tuned. You might get an email
All right.
in the next little while.
I'm happy to distribute that, man. Once again, man, thank you for your work, man. It's really impactful.
Pleasure.
I hope the people over at Western States and Badwater folks and Wasatch and all these other hot weather ultramarathon, they take note to this and reference the earlier podcast that we did together, as a couple of years ago now, on acclimation and acclimatization methods. That's these two things kind of combined really give you a really great resource on how to navigate this landscape.
Yep. Yeah. Again, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, good luck to everyone.
All right, folks. There you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Julien for coming back on the podcast as a repeat offender. And more importantly, thanks to him for all the work that he has done in the area. If you want almost everything you need to know about heat acclimation and heat acclimatization, I'm having a really hard time with that word today, check out the links that I have dropped in the show notes. It will take you a few hours to move through them all, but you will certainly be armored up for the heat, regardless of if you have time to prepare for it, or you're just racing this weekend or next weekend, or you're going into a race next year where you have plenty of time to prepare. I view this as one of the performance showstoppers, where if you do it right, you have everything in your corner, and if you don't do it right, you can screw it up royally. So take some time, get some knowledge in your corner, make sure you've got these methods and techniques and interventions correct, and you know which ones to use, and you have confidence in the ones that you can use as well. Appreciate the heck out of all the listeners out there. If you are running in this year's edition of the Western States 100, good luck. Have fun out there. Use all the ice that all the volunteers have out there for you. It does look like it's going to be a relatively warm year, or a year that's on the warmer side. But have fun out there. It's going to be a good one. Come by and say hi. We will be there with a battery of coaches supporting our 21 athletes that are running in the race, from the front of the pack to the middle of the pack and the back of the pack and everywhere in between. We're going to be out at nearly all of the aid stations with our tent. So come by and say hi. Good luck to everybody out there. And if you happen to be racing another hot weather race in the summer, good luck to you as well. I hope you gain some knowledge from this podcast. All right, folks, that is it for today. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.